So next we're going to separate this brace here from the transmission. We're going to use an 18mm deep socket, and it's just up underneath here. You'll feel the 2 bolts that's holding the transmission to this bracket. So the new transmission didn't come with this piece here. It's kind of like a rear bell housing. So we're going to go ahead and take our 10mm socket and take off all 6 of these. There's 3 on this side, and then another 3 on the other side. Okay, so with this rear piece removed, you'll notice there's a gasket between it. And these bolts, these were on the bottom, these were the middle, and these were the top. So the only ones that are really important are to put the bottom ones in because they're the longest, so they have to go in the same spot. You can see the factory used some blue Loctite on these, so if you want to put some new Loctite on it, then you can. And we're just gonna put on that gasket and the new piece and bolt it back to the new transmission. You want to make sure these mating surfaces are clean so that there's a good seal, and you may even want to put a little bit of gasket maker on here so that when you smash it flat that it's nice, but that's completely an option. It looks like the factory didn't do that. Now I've gone ahead and put this gasket on here, and I used some of this black Permatex, I really like that stuff, and put just a very thin layer on it, and just with my finger, just so that it's you know, somewhat smeared and covered. No globs or anything like that, but just to help it. And now we're going to go ahead and put that new piece, or the old piece I guess, back on here and tighten this down real good. Okay, so all these bolts, I ran them through and made sure that they were being threaded properly and not cross-threading, and just drove it on, and then went around and tightened them all down. I did put a little bit of gasket maker between it, so you can see it's starting to ooze out between the gasket on each side, and so when it's in perfect, then that should make a nice good seal for us. Okay, so now we're removing these transmission cooler lines that we left on. We disconnected them up front because it's easier to get to them that way. So to get these off, we're putting a 3/4 inch on this back bolt to steady it, and then it's a 5/8 inch wrench to actually get on here. So by holding those in place, we were able to break both of these loose. So we're just going to unscrew these lines and then attach them to our new transmission. Okay, make sure you take these off, because to line the transmission up, this has to come through the flex plate or the flywheel, whatever you want to call it. And so you got to take these off first if they came on a new transmission. So just make sure that that's off so that everything will line up. Okay, so I have the transmission back under the truck. I had to wheel it under on a furniture dolly because of the clearance. I couldn't quite get the truck high enough to get the transmission jack under here with the transmission on it. So just a little trick I used is I ran some ratcheting straps, put them into the frame there, went under the transmission, and did that also on the back. That way I was able to ratchet this up to lift it, because I'm doing this just as one person here. So I'm lifting the transmission off of this furniture dolly, and then I'll slide the transmission jack underneath it. Okay, so we're on our transmission jack. We have the chain wrapped up around it because this thing's pretty slick and slides around even on the transmission jack, just because the way that the pan is, there's just a small bulge at the bottom, so it doesn't really sit exactly flat. You can maybe throw some towels down or something on here to help level that out, whatever you want to do. I'm keeping the ratcheting straps in place and going underneath it on the front and the back, still just as an extra precaution in case this thing for some reason slips off the transmission jack. So as you continue to jack it up, keep ratcheting the straps just so that it's tight. And up in here, I made sure to get all the harnesses up out of the way. Especially watch the bracket that holds some of those things up there, because it'll get in your way and you're gonna have a hard time getting this to line up back with the block up there. So anyway, just take it slow, and it does help if you have another person to watch it on one side as you lift on the other. This is a good time to reattach the right there on that little nub. There's that's where one of the harnesses would connect. So while the transmission's not all the way up, go ahead and connect that. And like I said, look at the very, very top there and make sure that you don't have any brackets or anything right on those top bolts, because there's one that there is a bracket that goes there, and if it's hanging down in front of that flex plate, you're going to have some trouble. So this is the vent tube here that goes up, and it attaches to the bell housing after we're done up in there, and it's connected to the top of the transmission. You can reach through this hole in the heat shield and feel it up in there if you want to make sure that it is attached to the top of the transmission. And just as a point of reference, that's what it goes on right there. Go ahead and reconnect that white electrical plug. Okay, so we're getting closer here. We still have the chain around the transmission. Transmission jack's lifting this up real nice. And we just keep tightening these ratcheting straps as we go up, readjusting them and tightening them just in case something were to fall. That way it would just catch the transmission and not kill anybody. Now, what you want to pay attention to are these. They're called dowel pins, and they're sticking out, and they're what you line up here on the transmission, right up here in these holes. And it's just kind of what aligns the transmission as you get it up there. So once you get it close, you want to make sure that those dowel pins line up and go in, and that's when you can start threading your bolts. In the back here, we're about ready to put our transmission brace on the back and line it back up in here. So we're going to be doing that at the same time. But we just want to make sure that we're lining everything up. Once again, make sure there are no harnesses up in the top here that are going to get in the way of these transmission bolts. Now this might be hard to see, but there's a bracket here that just goes and puts pressure on the torque converter to keep it in place in shipping. It was at the top and I moved it down here so I could get to it a little more easily. But you want to be able to easily remove this as you're getting up in here closer, but the whole point is that that torque converter doesn't fall out while you're moving things around. Okay, so we took this little torque converter brace out because we're getting real close here. I'm just going to keep lining this up. Get ready to throw a few transmission bolts in there if we can get it lined up. The transmission jack here allows you to turn this wheel to pivot it this way, and then there's one down in here as well that allows you to pivot forward and backwards. Actually, it's right here now. So that allows it to pivot forward and backwards, so you just want to line it up the best that you can. Okay, just work it till you get closer and closer. Once again, you're lining up that dowel pin right there into the transmission, and then you can get some bolts started. Now you'll notice that these transmission bolts, 2 of them are going to be longer. I already put one in, but you can see that they're just slightly longer. So those longer ones are going to go in the dowel pin spot. Okay, so if you can start lining up a few bolts like this to get them into the block, just make sure none of them are forcing the transmission on, but start lining them up. That's going to help you get everything lined up perfect. And once again, watch out for those dowels that are aligning it, that you don't smash them. Okay, driver's side of the transmission, same thing. We're lining up the bolts there. You can see that dowel pin right there in the middle of the screen. It's lining up pretty good too. And so we're just threading the bolts, but not pushing anything or not forcing anything on. So try to get that good and lined up. Okay, so as you can see, everything's lining up real nice. Got our bolts started, the dowel pins are in. Make sure that on the very front that you have these torque converter bolts going through that flex plate. You can spin the torque converter by hand. You can reach up in here with your thumb and you can spin it until it lines up, but that's part of lining this up. And so once again, make sure that you have the little bolts off the front, or the little nuts off the front first. Alright, so once you have some of your transmission bolts there going through, you can put them in pretty much hand tight. You can even get to the top ones by hand if you fill up in there, but you'll still probably need to get extensions to tighten it down. Okay, so we're getting those very top transmission bolts with these long extensions, just the way we took them off. Coming from back here, pretty much behind the transmission, just to get to them. We're going to do that on both sides. So next, moving down here, we're going to move forward with putting our transmission brace back in. We have it suspended on the other side. And we're going to line it up here where it goes on the bottom of the transmission mount right there. So you just want to come through and make sure that your four-wheel drive shaft is up in here first, and your heat shield and everything is in the right spot before you lift that up and put it into place. And then these bolts, as you're putting them in, might need a little persuasion. Go ahead and put the nuts back on there and just make sure that everything's lined up here. We're going to go ahead and put those nuts back on to those transmission mount bolts too. So using a 18mm deep socket, come under here and tighten those transmission nuts and to make sure that they went through that cross member okay. Okay, so go ahead and tighten up this brace and its bolts. You have 18mm on this side and a 15mm on that side. Tighten up all the bolts on the transmission here. Get them as tight as you can. Then you can go ahead and lower the transmission jack. Come through here and make sure this dipstick tube goes back down into the transmission. There you go. Gotta wiggle it a little bit. Get it down in there, and then remember you have that 18mm bolt here. That's gonna go and secure the tube up here on that cylinder head. Okay, tighten up that bolt here. Just make sure that the dipstick tube bracket is on there, and that'll secure the dipstick tube. Okay, so we're replacing the starter now. It's easier to do this with the exhaust still disconnected. And remember, we have our two favorite tools for this. You have a 13mm regular socket on a long extension for the 1/4" drive, and then you have a 13mm deep socket for the bolt that has the stud on it. So just to show you here as a recap, so we're using that 1/4" drive with the long extension here so that we can get way back in there and turn the wrench. We got those two top bolts in. Then you have this bolt that has the deeper stud that you put on with the deep socket, and then the nut on the end that holds this ground on. So that's why you have to use that deep socket. So anyway, starter's back on. Okay, we're reconnecting these transmission cooler lines. It's a little tricky because the line that's in the top comes down and actually goes to the bottom. And so the one that is on the top of here, if you follow it back, actually goes into the bottom of the transmission. So don't get those confused. You have to make sure that you thread these very gently because it's a very soft aluminum. You don't want anything to cross thread. As you can see, I've had to stick a screwdriver in here between the lines just to move them around enough to get them to thread straight. So you might have to, work with it a little bit, but you want to make sure that these are going in straight and not stripping or cross threading. Okay, so we used a 1/2 inch wrench to tighten these down, and just make sure that you get them tight, but don't break anything because it is fragile. Okay, now it's time to install these torque converter bolts. So as you may have remembered when we took it off, what we're doing is coming up to the crankshaft pulley, and it has an 18mm bolt on the very front of that. And so you have to reach up with your breaker bar and turn that crankshaft. Now you're only going to get a certain amount of range out of it, so turn it until that one of those torque converter nuts starts to come down, and then what you can do is take this off, turn it a 1/4 of a turn and put it back on the breaker bar again, and that'll give you the ability to turn that crankshaft more until these bolts start to come down. Okay, once they come down, we're using a 14mm wrench on these, and it has the little the bendable head on it. Makes it real easy to get onto these up in here. And so I've tightened these down. As you can see, there's a little bit of Loctite that I put on these, and I went around a few times just to make sure that everything was even, because I went around the first time and just put these on somewhat tight. Then the next time around I tightened them all down, and then I checked it a third time to make sure they're all even and tight. And so now our torque converter section is back on. So we can go ahead and reinstall our plate here. A little dust shield plate that goes on here, and it just has these 2 bolts. Okay, that dust shield's back on with those 13mm bolts right there. We're going to go ahead and put our little plug in here.